do is I will pass around some, I have 5 copies of something that will become interesting to you. So you can either read it before it happens as part of the discussion, or after. That's up to you, but I'll just kind of like, randomly give them to a few people, and you'll either get one or you won't.
Okay. This is Jewish, so there has to be something to read.
So please continue passing.
Okay. Well, let me start. This is Vicki Harrison, and I want to begin actually by thanking her. She's the head of our Jewish Studies program, and was responsible, is every year responsible for organizing the Levinson Memorial Lecture. And I have to say she really outdid herself this year, as you will hear. I also want to say something about Bob Levinson, who was a professor in the history department. He began the Jewish Studies program here at San Jose State, passed away in 1979. I want to thank his wife, his widow, Faye, his sons, David and Aaron, who are here, and Daniel, who couldn't be here, for their support of Jewish Studies here at San Jose State. The Levinson Lecture has really been the thing that's kept the program going, I would say, many, many years, until Vicki came along to make it rise again like a phoenix from the ashes. I also want to mention, and this is one of the things I really feel that Jewish Studies has really come back in a big way. And one of those things that we've accomplished is with our new Jewish Studies collection here in the library, on the 5th floor of the library. And I wanted to thank the library and Cabrera and Vicki for helping that come about, but especially Rabbi Kaplan, who I think is here, who gave us a wonderful donation of books and really got it going, the seed of that collection. Now, it's really a pleasure and a privilege and an honor to introduce Jonathan Sarna. He's the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University in Massachusetts. He's the Chief Historian of the new National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. He chairs the Academic Advisory and Editorial Board of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. Gets around. He served as Chief Historian for the 350th commemoration of the American Jewish community in America. He is the author, co-author, or editor of over 30 books, and has written more than 200 articles, chapters, encyclopedia articles, and reviews. But mere numbers do not convey adequately the impact of Professor Sarna's work in Jewish and Jewish American history. As you know, I am a historian of the ancient world, though I make my forays into modernity as my History of Modern Israel class. But as a student of ancient Near Eastern studies in Berkeley in the 1970s, which I just found out Vicki was also there, the name Sarna was already known to me. Professor Sarna's father, Nahum Sarna, of blessed memory, was one of the premier biblical scholars of his generation. Jonathan Sarna is as renowned as his father, is a scholar of Jews and Judaism in America. In 2004, The Forward, one of the most important Jewish publications in this country, named Professor Sarna as one of America's 50 most influential American Jews. He was born in Philadelphia, like me, with one English Jewish parent. I just found out that our great-grandparents, great-grandfathers lived on the same street, Sydney Street in the East End. He was raised in New York and Boston. He attended Brandeis, Boston Hebrew College, the Merkaz HaRav Kook, the Rabbi Kook Center in Jerusalem, the Yale University, where he obtained his doctorate in 1979, writing his dissertation on Mordecai Manuel Noah, a fascinating character, the first Jew to become an American consul, as well as one of the earliest proponents of Zionism, I think certainly the earliest in America, as well as head of Tammany Hall for a while. From 1979 to 1990, Professor Sarna taught at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, where he became a professor of American Jewish history and director of the Center for the Study of the American Jewish Experience. He's also taught at Yale, University of Cincinnati, and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He returned to Brandeis in 1990 to teach American Jewish history in its Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies. He served 2 terms as chair of that department and 1 as director of Brandeis's Hornstein Jewish Professional Leadership Program. Professor Sarna is certainly the leading expert on the role of Jews in the American Civil War. He edited a collection of primary sources on the subject, and a PBS special documentary, Jewish Soldiers in Blue and Gray, featured Professor Sarna. His new book, When Grant Expelled the Jews, explores a key event in Jewish American history. This and its political aftermath is the subject of today's talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Sarna.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Well, thank you. Let's see. Thank you very much. Always wonderful to meet another Jonathan as well. And so it's really a great pleasure to be here. I knew Professor Levinson when I was a graduate student. I met him. He was very encouraging, and there weren't so many people in the field of American Jewish history back then. And he was deeply interested in the 19th century, and as you heard, I have done most of my work in the 19th century, so we had much to talk about. And he was deeply interested in religion, and in fact, he was a good cantor, I'm told, and at that time, I also was able to be a cantor, so we even had that, not anymore, but we had that in common. I had correspondence with him about his wonderful work in the Western cemeteries, which I'm so glad to hear the family is continuing. And Bob also was one of the earliest people to begin to comb through the Western newspapers for information about Jews. Today, that's much easier using a computer. He did it in the old days when he had to type all of this out, but he made fabulous finds. His book on Jews in the Gold Rush is still the basic book on that subject. And indeed, I went back and looked, and he's got some material bearing on the subject of my talk this afternoon on the election of 1868. He understood its significance and had some interesting primary material. He was taken from us much too soon, but I am very proud to be able to dedicate this lecture to his memory. Now, my subject begins really just where you started it here, with a pamphlet. The pamphlet is here, and it's a 16-page pamphlet published by the National News Company in New York in June of 1868, and it was entitled, with no effort at all at subtlety, General Grant and the Jews. It was sold for 10 cents. It's very valuable today, so if you see any copies, be sure to pay 10 cents for them, even more. And one assumes, knowing something about political pamphlets in the 19th century, that a lot of them were distributed at the time for free. Interesting thing is the author is listed as a man who spells his name, those of you who have copies, P.H., I presume, Philip von Bort. I spent many hours trying to find out who this man might possibly have been. He is otherwise unknown. I suspect it's a pseudonym. We know a lot about the Jews who lived in New York at that time, and there's no von Bort among them. The interesting thing for those of you who have copies is if you go to the very last page, on page 16, it's signed not P.H. von Bort, but rather yours, thank you, yours obediently, a Jew. I assume that Mr. Van Bort was simply a pseudonym, although, as you'll hear, I have some thoughts of who may have been behind it. Most of the librarians, we're in a library, also consider it a pseudonym, but it's perfectly clear that this pamphlet was authored by one of General Grant's Democratic Party opponents. Now, the timing of this very curious pamphlet, there were not so many pamphlets with titles like this. The timing in June of 1868 is no accident. For months, pundits had declared that Grant, who was, after all, a national hero, General-in-Chief of the armies of the United States. By the way, that is a higher rank than George Washington held. Nobody had been General-in-Chief of the armies of the United States, and everyone assumed that he was going to be the Republican forerunner in the 1868 presidential election. The war veterans met in Chicago. They all but demanded that he be selected, and his own father, Jesse Grant, spoke up in his son's behalf. Those who know about Ulysses S. Grant, some called him Ulysses the Silent, know that he said not a word, but he knew what was going on. His wife left us with a memoir. She was the talkative one in the family, and in her memoir she writes that Ulysses said to her, "The convention is about to assemble, and from all I hear, they will nominate me." And that, in fact, is exactly what happened. On May the 21st, he was nominated unanimously, and on the very first ballot, as the Republican standard bearer for the White House, Schuyler Colfax, who had been the Speaker of the House, became his running mate. Now, that posed an unprecedented problem for American Jews. Some of you heard a whole lecture on this subject, but I'll summarize it briefly for the benefit of everyone else. Back on December the 17th, 1862, in other words, in the Civil War, prior to Vicksburg and his other wartime successes, Grant, in a fit of anger over smuggling, and particularly over his father's rather shady deal with Jewish clothing manufacturers Harmon Henry and Simon Mack. They wanted to move Southern cotton northward. Grant, angry at that, he, of course, believed that you would end the war faster if no money moved to the South. He had issued an infamous order known as General Orders Number 11, whose main paragraph read as follows: "The Jews, as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department, and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order." And that is the most anti-Semitic official order in all of American history. And as a result, a small number of Jews were expelled from Grant's territories. He was general not yet of the whole army, but of a quite considerable area. And his territories in Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, some Jews were expelled. Many more would have been expelled had Abraham Lincoln not overturned that infamous order less than 3 weeks after it was issued. Now, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Grant has a string of victories. That's always good. If you've made a mistake, people forget the mistake, and all they remember is your victories. And so furor over the order quickly subsided, and in 1863, practically nothing more was heard of General Orders Number 11 for the next 5 years. But now that Grant was a candidate for the presidency of the United States, of course, the order took on fresh significance, especially to the opposition party. They could trumpet it in order to puncture the halo around U.S. Grant. Yeah, what did it reveal about his character and his qualifications for office? Could Jews vote for a man, even a national hero, who once had expelled Jews as a class from his war zone? And if Jews wouldn't vote for Grant on that basis, would that set them apart from the multitudes who viewed Grant as the savior of his country? Grant was maybe the most popular American, certainly to Northerners, for having saved the Union. And would this whole episode raise the ugly specter of dual loyalty, suggesting that Jews cared more about Jewish issues than about the welfare of the country as a whole? So this was not a small matter that a man with this in his background was now a candidate for the presidency. The Democratic Party had been gaining power in local and state elections during the last years of Andrew Johnson's presidency. Even Grant's own hometown of Galena, Illinois, had elected a Democratic mayor. And when your own, hero a party is not elected in your own hometown, that's a bad sign. And everybody forecast a very close national election. And the reason that's important is that if there's going to be a very close election, then maybe a Jewish community, even though it only had about 150 to 200,000 total Jews in 1868, and that, of course, included women. They hadn't been invented yet, so they couldn't vote and hadn't been discovered. They didn't vote, and, of course, children didn't vote, and some of the immigrants didn't vote. So you might think the Jewish vote couldn't have been very important. But one of the lessons of American politics is in a close election, every vote matters. Still true. Moreover, Americans have regularly exaggerated the size and the political power of the Jewish community. That was true in 1868. It's still true in 2012 as well. And so in a bid to attract Jewish voters and to puncture the halo around Grant, Democrats seized on General Orders Number 11. And one of their goals was certainly to lure Jewish Republicans into the Democratic camp. So our pamphlet, which I see is going around, General Grant and the Jews, clearly was meant to advance that goal. It opened, and those of you who have copies can follow along, it opened with the full text of General Orders Number 11 and challenged Grant to answer whether the document furnished a guide to, quote, your character, to the standard of your education, to your sense of justice, to your humanity, to your understanding of the foundations on which the nation has become great, to your qualifications for the presidential chair. The pamphlet went on. Instead of searching out the guilty individuals, meaning smugglers, punishing them and preventing a repetition of the crime, you have condemned the innocent with the guilty, and you have thus degraded the action of a judge into a deed of brutal and vindictive cruelty. You get a sense they weren't very subtle in their political language in those days. Then there is a rather interesting, very lengthy defense of the Jewish people, suggesting that some of the readers would require that defense. And then the pamphlet proceeds to the attack with some amazing language. As a class, you have stigmatized and expelled us. it's speaking as if this author was speaking in the name of all American Jews. Some authors still do that, but it was one guy. And he continues, as a class, we rise up and vote against you like one man. A political threat, and the pamphlet, again, it literally says, in the name of all American Jews, concluded with a bold and, I think, really unprecedented statement of Jewish power. More recently, the small communities consider it anti-Semitic to talk about Jewish power. But back then, you have this remarkable statement of Jewish power, remarkable, I think, for what it reveals about American Jewry's confident optimism in 1868, but I think deeply discomforting to us to hear it, because we know that anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists would later turn such characterizations back against Jews and accuse them of controlling the destinies of nations. But it's fascinating to read what he writes. We are numerous. We are influential. We are wealthy. We are diffused over the whole continent. We are as one family wherever our influence reaches every Jew, no matter of what political party. Every Jew with the votes he can command will endeavor to defeat, and with God's blessing will defeat you. And with that, our pamphlet concludes. Pretty strong and memorable language. Whenever I read it, I'm reminded of that old joke, you know, of the Jews in Germany, and they all would read the Jewish paper and terrible, terrible news, and there was one Jew who read Der Stürmer, the Nazi paper. Nobody could understand why he reads it. He said, very simple. I read the Jewish paper. I read about persecutions and disappearances and terrible news. I read Der Stürmer. It says the Jews control the world. The Jews are strong. The Jews this, the Jews that. It makes me feel good. So in a sense, that's how I think about this pamphlet. In any case, here you had, and I'm not familiar if anybody is with a similar kind of statement. Earlier, I'd love to hear about it. Here you had a pamphlet written to defeat the Republican Party, and that's not a small matter. Let me sketch out a bit of the political context in 1868. It was a very important election because in the balance in 1868 hung the fate of 4 million freedmen, African Americans freed from slavery. They had benefited politically, socially, and economically from the benevolent Reconstruction policies that Republicans had championed. And those who remember their history or remember reading Eric Foner know that the opposition Democrats, firmly aligned with the white race, promised sharp policy changes to rescue the country from the anarchy of radicalism. It's really astonishing. It's still amazing to go back and read political propaganda from the Democrats in 1868. One of their lines was, "The Negro may become a Republican, a slave, or a tyrant, but never a Democrat." So this was a very important election, and whether Grant won or the Democrats won was going to affect the fate of millions of people. And against that background, liberal-minded Jews who disagreed with the author of General Grant and the Jews, they disagreed with this pamphlet, and they supported the Republican Party's policy because of its attitudes towards the freedmen. These liberal Jews got busy. So, for example, Louis Dembitz Dembitz was a noted Louisville attorney and scholar. He courageously had opposed slavery, was an early supporter of Abraham Lincoln, as well as the uncle and idol of Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. I have to mention Louis Brandeis in every lecture. It's in my contract, so I've fulfilled that. But Louis Dembitz sent a letter of inquiry concerning General Orders Number 11 to Grant's headquarters. And Grant's spokesman sends him a very courteous reply telling Dembitz exactly what he and other Jewish Republicans wanted to hear. Allegations that General Order Number 11 was issued on account of the religion of the Jews cannot be seriously entertained by anyone who knows the general's steadfast adherence to the principles of American liberty and religious toleration. So Grant's PR people insisted that had nothing to do with Jews. And Simon Wolf, the leader of B'nai B'rith, gets the same reply. And they actually are satisfied with that reply. They come out in support of Grant. In fact, Wolf is going to campaign tirelessly as a Jew on U.S. Grant's behalf, which proves that all Jews were not of one mind when it came to the 1868 election. Actually, they rarely are of one mind. I can assure you that's also true of most groups. The Jewish banking family, led by Joseph Seligman, also strongly supported Grant. The Grants and the Seligmans had known one another for 20 years. The majority of American Jews, however, were not so easily won over as those folks. Observers like the New York Times, which I should point out was not yet owned by the Oaks family, it was not a Jewish-owned paper, predicted a wholesale defection of Jews to the Democratic Party. Joseph Medill, who was a very important political pundit in the 19th century. There's a journalism school named for Joseph Medill at Northwestern. Joseph Medill, the Republican editor of the Chicago Tribune, believed that the Jews of Cincinnati and St. Louis are numerous enough to defeat our ticket in both cities, and they are strong enough to hurt us in Chicago also, as they include many of our most active Republicans. Unless Grant put the issue of General Orders Number 11 to rest with a strong public statement, he warned, we shall lose large numbers of Jew votes, that's his words, besides converting them into very active, bitter opponents. So there's a lot of discussion of the Jewish vote, which is really quite astonishing, considering that this is before East European Jews come en masse. Grant later admitted that he had received, this is his term, hundreds of letters from Jews inquiring about his order. Refusing to budge from his principles, he wrote, I thought it would be better to adhere to the rule of silence as to all letters. I don't recommend that rule to anybody here who wants to run for public office. Grant answered none of those letters. As a result, just as Medill had feared, the Democrats bustled about making a political weapon of Grant's expulsion order in all parts of the country. Now, something called the Democratic Speaker's Handbook, prepared by the party for its loyal supporters in the days before email and so on. You prepared a big book for people who were going to run around the country speaking on behalf of your candidate. These are wonderful sources for historians. There you can find them on Google Books. And this Democratic Speaker's Handbook trumpeted the issue of General Orders Number 11 for Democratic speakers. So in case you think, I'm making all of this up, it wasn't that big an issue, I was so happy to see that in the official handbook prepared for Democratic speakers, they make a big deal about it. It devotes 3 double-column small print pages to what it calls General Grant on our fellow Hebrew citizens and recounts the whole episode to the bulk of Democrats, who of course knew nothing about it. It wasn't that well known in 1862, much better known in 1868. And that section concluded with lines that the handbook likely expected party speakers on every stump to echo. Violating trade? Indeed, why, that order was violated everywhere. No, the Jews were persecuted because they were Jews and nothing else. I actually suspect that the Democrats were influenced by longtime chair of the National Democratic Party, the financier August Belmont. That's the same Belmont as the Belmont racetrack. Belmont was a thoroughly Americanized Jew married to the daughter of Commodore Matthew Perry, and he raised his children as good Episcopalians, but his enemies certainly reminded him that he was, quote, a foreign-born Jew, and his name hadn't been Belmont either, and he therefore understood as well as any politician of his day that the Jewish issue could be a potent weapon in the Democratic Party's campaign arsenal. Now, the Democratic Party ticket, when they finally decided who they were going to run against Grant, really highlighted the national divide in 1868. Its candidates were Horatio Seymour. Seymour was a former New York governor who'd opposed the Emancipation Proclamation, and his running mate was Francis Blair of Missouri. That's a border state senator. Blair had supported the Civil War, but promised voters, if elected, quote, to prevent the people of our race from being driven out of the country or trodden underfoot by an inferior and semi-barbarous race. So you get a sense of who the Democratic Party was seeking to attract. And really, I see the 1868 election as something of a national referendum on Reconstruction and black suffrage. And that ups the ante for Jewish voters, because they may have choked at the thought of voting for Ulysses S. Grant, but still strongly supported the Republican Party's policies on Reconstruction. And they faced a very difficult conundrum, maybe for the first time, certainly not for the last time. Should Jews vote for a party they considered bad for the country, meaning the Democrats, just to avoid voting for a man who had been bad to the Jews, meaning Grant? And the closer the election drew, the more heated rhetoric actually within the Jewish community became over who Jews should vote for in this election. Simon Wolfe, who I mentioned earlier, came out in favor, big B'nai B'rith leader, comes out in favor of Grant. He insisted Jews should vote their principles. However ill-worded Grant's order might have been, that is no reason, he exclaimed, why American citizens should be betrayed from their allegiance to principles and turn to a party that advocated the reverse of what is right and true. By contrast, Sir Moses Ezekiel, was later a very significant sculptor. He produced a parade of Confederate war monuments, and if you go to Arlington, you'll see his work. He was from Richmond. He was, as I said, a Confederate veteran, and he insisted that Jewish religious principles, as he understood them, required him to vote against Grant. And listen to his language. The Jew who does not, with all his heart, soul, and means, oppose the election of this second Pharaoh deserves to be publicly branded as a renegade to his faith. So he certainly agreed with the author of General Grant and the Jews. And astonishingly, and really I know of no precedent for this, there were anti-Grant public gatherings by Jews in city after city, Memphis, Nashville, Atlanta, St. Louis, and Los Angeles, all had anti-grant gatherings. What's interesting is most of those cities are either southern or border. Los Angeles is the exception. And Professor Levinson actually printed quite a lot of material about poems and other attacks on Grant for in the Gold Rush newspapers as well. So it was a big issue even out here in California. The Jewish merchants of Atlanta, who were apparently not shy, erected a transparency on Whitehall Street that proclaimed the Jews will defeat Grant as they defeated Haman. The Jews will elevate Grant to office as they elevated Haman. You got to know your Bible to understand what that means. But when they talked about elevating Haman, they knew their book of Esther. Haman was elevated by a rope around his neck. Never before had America witnessed such a public display of political power on the part of its Jewish citizens. Now, actually, from the perspective of modern Jewish history, this is a fascinating, really transformative development. In the wake of Jewish political emancipation in Europe, many Western and Central European Jews came to eschew the exercise of Jewish power through group politics of any sort. So, for example, Sephardic Jews in London in 1648 threatened excommunication to anyone who voted in an election or took sides on a political question. The safest thing for Jews who has been emancipated is not to be involved in politics at all. Even after Jews received their rights as a group, often based on special legislation, what they used to call Jew bills, they were expected to exercise their rights, if at all, solely as individuals. The last thing most Jews wanted in the 19th century was to stir up old anti-Semitic charges that they were a state within a state, caring more for their fellow Jews than for their country. So, as to protect their rights as individuals, Jews were taught to piously insist that they no longer voted on the basis of any interest that they shared with other Jews. In other words, group politics was something that most European Jews gave up, at least on the surface, after emancipation. Now, in America, where the Constitution treated Jews as equals and never mentioned the word Jew at all, Jews in America get their rights with everyone else, immigrant Jews nevertheless tended to follow these same carefully nurtured modern European political habits. There were really four unwritten rules of proper Jewish political behavior that are preached over and over again in the 19th century. One, Jews may not band together in separate political clubs. Two, rabbis or lay leaders have no right to advise the community on how to vote. Three, Jewish agencies must not use their influence to promote Jewish aspirants to public office. And four, Jews may not support a candidate just because he happens to be Jewish. Now, what happens in the 1868 election is that those who preached those laws in public often violated them in private. To them, and really to their descendants well into the 20th century, you find these rules being preached publicly. And then if you're a good historian and you go into the archives, you find, wow, privately, these guys did the opposite of what they preached. They said, wouldn't it be great to have this Jew in office? And how can you vote for that anti-Semite? And publicly they say, oh, no, we don't vote on Jewish issues at all. How do you explain it? I think to many Jews, Jewish politics, meaning the raw exercise of Jewish power, became something akin to sexual intercourse. Practice, that's the only sex you get in this lecture, so you may as well enjoy it. Practiced openly, it was embarrassing and shameful. Done discreetly behind closed doors, it was natural and legitimate. And it's not those of you who've read the literature on Victorian England and America know that hypocrisy of this kind is not limited to this instant, but there's really an enormous disjunction between what they preach and what they do. And that really explains why some of the most politically active Jews, like Simon Wolf or later Louis Marshall, always vigorously insist there's no such thing as Jewish group politics, even as they actively engaged in Jewish group politics behind the scenes. Then, as now, many did not practice what they preached. Now, the more vexing question, I think, in 1868, and no less relevant today, are questions of multiple loyalties. Those who injected General Orders Number 11 into the campaign, like the author of our pamphlet, plainly sought to appeal to Jewish voters on the basis of their special interest in that issue. It is directed to Jews. But is it legitimate for Jews to base their vote on such considerations? Or in selecting a presidential candidate, should Jews as voters cast aside all special interests and consider only the national interest? More to the point, should General Orders Number 11 single-handedly determine how Jews vote? Yeah, should it be the kind of issue that is what we today call, nobody used this term then, a litmus test issue? Or ought responsible voters to weigh up the totality of issues facing the country before making up their minds? And what we actually see is that two of America's most distinguished Reform rabbis debated that very question in the newspapers. Liebman Adler, the rabbi of Chicago's oldest synagogue, KAM is the way it's usually called. Today, I mentioned this at another lecture, so it is exactly opposite Barack Obama's home in Chicago, KAM. But Rabbi Liebman Adler argued against voting on the basis of Jewish interests and in favor of broad American interests. Proud as I am of being a Jew, he explained, it's different when I take a ballot in order to exercise my rights as citizens. Then I'm not a Jew, and I feel and act as a citizen of the Republic. And he insisted that on Election Day you only consult the welfare of the country. In fact, he provocatively declared he would vote even for the party of Haman, which is just what the Republican Party was in the eyes of the Democrats, if he believed that it would do most for the welfare of the country and the advancement of human rights. This is such a long, it's a long quote, but it's so unbelievable that I have to read it to you. He writes, if that party in whose hands I believe the welfare of the country so far as the advancement of human rights was concerned. Let me say as an aside, today, for reasons I do not know, the scholars of human rights believe that human rights, even the term, is a 20th century invention. I do not believe that is correct. There's a lot of evidence, not only its use here, but in Grant's whole presidency, he's interested in human rights. And so if someone wants to kind of earn a good doctorate, you can show that human rights, it's the whole literature, and it's all wrong, can be pushed back to a much earlier. In any case, if that party in whose hands I believe the welfare of the country so far as the advancement of human rights was concerned was the safest, were to place Haman at the helm of state, and if the opposite party, whose non-existence I believe would be better for humanity and my country, were to place Messiah at their head, make Moses the Chief Justice, and call the patriarchs to the cabinet, I should say, prosper under Haman, my fatherland, and here you have my vote, even if all the Jew in me mourns. Now, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the great leader of Reform Jewry in America, could not have disagreed more. These are two Reform rabbis arguing over the issue. Wise says, if wrong is wrong, he who defends it is wicked. And he insists that identities can't really be compartmentalized. Oh, here I'm an American and here I'm a Jew. It is a piece of sophistry, Wise declared, that one can be one half of himself. In other words, that you can be a Jew and you can be an American and you can separate those two. Wise concluded that basically one should vote for Grant, and civil and religious liberty is a sacred boon which must be protected against each and every aggression. We must speak and act according to the very dictates of conscience and conviction. Now, the truth is that no final decision ever resolves that debate. It arises anew like the phoenix every time some Jewish issue, most recently support for Israel, intrudes into a presidential campaign. The same intensity, many of the same arguments, only differences in detail distinguish, I think, the debates over how Jews should vote in Grant's day from the debates in our own. Then as now, the tensions inherent in the term American Jew, embracing responsibilities to country and to fellow Jews, heighten the challenge of casting a presidential ballot. Nor are Jews alone in facing this dilemma. Parallel tensions face members of almost every ethnic, religious, special interest group, weighing up competing claims, establishing priorities among principles and concerns, reaching a decision about whom to support can make voting an excruciatingly difficult, if deeply self-revealing process. Now, back in 1868, most of the smart pundits thought that most Jews would vote against Ulysses S. Grant and in favor of Horatio Seymour. We will actually never know if that is correct or not. Nobody identifies themselves when they go to the polls. All I can tell you is Grant had a big win. He won by 309,000 votes, 134 electoral votes. So the Jewish vote couldn't possibly have made much of a difference. If anything, as John Hope Franklin showed, the 500,000 African-American votes cast in 1868, it was still a time when blacks voted, especially in the South, probably made more of a difference in that election and may have swung it in his favor. And then there is this epilogue, which is really fitting to the whole battle for the Jewish vote. In the final weeks of November, after the election, Ulysses S. Grant told Jews just what they had wanted to hear from him and just what they wanted to hear from a president-elect. I do not pretend to sustain the order, he said. And he went on, I have no prejudice against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit. I do not sustain that order. And then he goes on. Now, he didn't issue that order earlier, but he didn't issue that declaration earlier. He was afraid people would say it was pandering to the Jewish vote, but it's not a small matter that Grant issued that statement. It's unthinkable that Ferdinand and Isabella would have sent an apology for expelling Jews in 1492, or Tsar Nicholas would have apologized for the pogroms. So we don't have so many apologies of this kind in history. And Jews, I have to say, united in praise of what they called Grant's noble and generous letter. And I think that what Grant did in saying, I do not sustain that order, was to confess misdeed and ally himself with values that, in the Civil War's wake, liberal Americans cherished above all. Yes, freedom for all, malice toward none, as Lincoln called it, prejudice, and Grant had come to understand that prejudice toward Jews was really as unacceptable as prejudice toward blacks. And now he articulates a higher vision for Americans. I want each individual to be judged by his own merit. And the truth is that as president, and then for the remainder of his life, Grant tries to act in accord with this latter declaration. He appointed more Jews to public office than all previous presidents combined, went out of his way to promote human rights for Jews in Russia and Romania, and by the end of his life had actually become a hero to America's Jews, whose death is deeply mourned. So the story of Grant and the Jews turned out very differently than our pseudonymous 1868 pamphleteer expected. Over the last 17 years of his life, Grant transformed himself from an enemy of the Jews to their friend, from a general who expelled Jews as a class to a president who embraced Jews as individuals. And in retrospect, the election of Ulysses S. Grant in 1868 marked, among many other things, a political coming of age for American Jews. It engaged them as Jews in the political arena and opened up questions concerning their political responsibilities that remain unresolved to this day. Should Jews vote for a party they consider bad for the country just to avoid voting for a man who had been bad or might be bad for the Jews? That question, inspired by General Grant and the Jews back in 1868, remains, I think, surprisingly relevant today. Thanks very much. You know, I've been looking at that clock, and I said to myself, oh, I got lots and lots of time. And we stopped. This is a very dangerous thing to do for a lecturer, for a professor. I don't recommend it, to have a stopped clock. All right. But you tell me, do we have time for questions?
We have time.
Oh, good. My plane leaves at 11. Well, you stood first, so we'll give you the first shot. Yeah.
I presume this issue didn't come up in 1864.
No, because Grant didn't run in 1864. Well, Lincoln was running in 1864. There was no...
In the Union Party, the Republican Party was renamed Union.
Right.
In 1864, Missouri voted for Grant over Lincoln for that nomination.
Yeah, and Lincoln, of course, was very nervous about Grant winning, although he has some great line, Lincoln, that he's feels like the man who's told that he's going to die, but said, if I'm going to die, this is the way I want to die. And that was his comment on Grant running. But I am not aware of any discussion of in 1864 because most people thought Lincoln was going to run again, and he does. Yeah.
Second, just real quick, there was a bloody shirt campaign started in 1868. Did that factor in to all this?
I think that it is part of, you know, the issues that arise in the campaign. I mean, but you didn't necessarily have a Jewish part, you know, to the bloody shirt campaign, but it is certainly part of the ugly politics that is going to be part of American politics. Jonathan, yeah.
Jews fought in the Civil War on
Right.
both sides, and there were certainly Jewish Union veterans. Was there any attempt either to organize Jewish veterans or to speak as a veteran, either for or against Trump?
You know, I looked for that, and there should have been, but I didn't find, you know, a group of Jewish veterans. And the truth is, some of those who fought under Grant were really angry when he issued General Orders number 11. At least one resigns from the Army, presumably because his own position became untenable. So, you know, it may be that there were some who had mixed feelings. The man who was highest in Grant's army was a man named Marcus Spiegel. Some of you will remember the Spiegel catalog. That's the same family, but unfortunately poor Marcus Spiegel, who did come up the ranks, but he didn't survive the war, so he couldn't exactly utter any views on that matter. But anyway, I did think of it, and I didn't find that soldiers under Grant, Jewish ones, really organized, and that might have made a difference. The strongest pro-Grant figure is really Simon Wolfe, who didn't fight in the Civil War, but was a kind of publicist and lawyer and worked for the B'nai B'rith, and he becomes a Grant acolyte. He names his son Adolf Grant Wolfe. The name Adolf later loses popularity in Jewish circles for reasons it sounds like you can figure out. Yeah?
Is it possible that Von Bort was not Jewish, but his own kind of operative or something?
You know, I spent more time than he probably deserved trying to find out who he is. The pamphlet is signed a Jew. It certainly read to me like it was someone who had some knowledge of the Jewish community. Your comment is a smart one in that there are earlier cases, indeed, I wrote the article, of a pamphlet by an Israelite, as a pamphlet that appears in the it's about 1820, called Israel Vindicated, by a man who calls himself an Israelite. And I argued, and no doubt all of you were persuaded, that it really was a man named George Houston, who was not Jewish at all, but was a prominent American freethinker. And I found whole paragraphs in Houston's writings that were just pushed into this pamphlet, and found other evidence. So in 1820, there was such a case. But in this case, and maybe one of you will discover it, I can't find any Van Bort. I mean, I looked in all of the standard ways that I thought of. If anybody finds a Van Bort and can identify him, please let me know. But I tend to think it's a pseudonym. And oftentimes, and here we're in a library traditions, I wasn't able to trace the tradition, but I have respect for librarians' traditions, and the tradition in cataloging is that it's a pseudonym. So I eventually came to that. But you never know how somebody will find it. You know, you find in an odd newspaper when someone dies that years earlier he had written such a thing, and that can be the resolution. And more stuff is going online. So if you find it, shoot me an email. Please, yeah.
Well, my question is, with Grant's order, order number 11, in what ways were the Jews discriminated?
Well, so some people here had heard that lecture, and that's the first part of my book. But Grant literally the order, which I read, expels Jews from his war zone. But what is remarkable is that where you might have expected thousands of Jews would have been expelled, Memphis, after all, was a very significant sized Jewish community, there weren't so many Jews who you can actually point to who were expelled. There are Jews expelled from Holly Springs, and then there are all the Jews who are expelled from Paducah. Paducah is the place where the order is effected, but Caesar Caskell, one of those Jews expelled from Paducah, races down like a kind of Civil War era Paul Revere to Washington, spreading news of the order wherever he went, and Lincoln overturns the order in record time. I had the good fortune to lecture on this material at the at the National Archives, and I pointed out that the Jews were expelled from Paducah on December the 27th. Lincoln overturns the order on January the 3rd, and I wondered whether Washington could move so quickly today. And they all cheered. So that's why not more people are affected, because Lincoln overturns the order within a week. Yeah?
I was just listening to a show on the History Channel about the South before I came here, and said that around I think it was sometime that the largest number of Jews per square mile was in Charleston, South Carolina.
Certainly, Charleston is not in Grant's territory. So the order would not have been affected. In my book, I have a map of Grant's territory, and South Carolina isn't part of it. And of course, you knew that because Sherman is going to march to South Carolina, although in the end, he doesn't go to Charleston. He goes around and burns Columbia. But in any case, Charleston is a very large Jewish community. There is a short period of time after the American Revolution, from the American Revolution to 1820, when Charleston is the largest Jewish community in the United States. However, and here's where I'm a little puzzled by, Charleston really declines as a community because the Erie Canal means that a lot of business that used to go to the port of Charleston now is going out of the port of New York, and a lot of cotton is shipped east through the Erie Canal. That devastates Charleston's economy, and Charleston is also there is a slave revolt in Charleston in the 1820s, and those two had a big effect. So Charleston is an important and interesting community, but I suspect by 1860 its Jewish numbers are significantly down. I wouldn't know whether there are more Jews per square inch there. I have my doubts that there are more per square inch than there are in New York, but I wouldn't be able to prove it easily, not knowing how many Jews per square inch there are anywhere. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, and it's really been a pleasure and privilege. Thanks.
This is Jade for refreshments. I think there's a little more food, and I think Professor Sarna will be here for another 15, 20 minutes.
I'm not going anywhere.
Well, we're taking it away.